Oh! Stopped just in time. Umamusume Pretty Derby has taken the world by storm recently, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk a little bit more about a sports tabletop RPG, or a tabletop RPG focused around some sort of big sporting event. We talk an awful lot about Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy epics when we talk about tabletop RPGs, but we don't really talk about some of the more casual, role-play orientated tabletop RPGs that you could play, or even the sort of games where the highest stakes are not necessarily the end of the world. So tune in if you're interested in talking a little bit more about an oddball RPG. We're going to be talking about some of the things we could do to make this amazing tabletop RPG a reality, and also some things that you could do to maybe improve your own campaigns. I'm the Extragalactic Unicorn. Let's get into it. So some of the things we're going to be talking about, first off, we're going to be talking about the fact that this isn't Dungeons and Dragons. This is very much a different kind of narrative that we're building here, so we need to do things a little bit differently. We can't just treat this like it's a dungeon crawler. This is going to be a much more roleplay centric, roleplay orientated challenge. Some of the challenges that we're going to have are going to be races. If you're doing another kind of sporting activity, then it's whatever sporting activity you're going to be doing. But if we're talking about Umamusume specifically, then we're going to be talking about races as the main kind of problem that we're going to be having alongside of the social aspect of things. We're also going to be talking about the scene technique, about how you can break up some of these scenes to break up some of the more monotonous parts of moving around. We're also going to be talking about the general adventure structure that you could do for this kind of adventure. We're also going to be talking about event clocks to create some sort of tension. We're also going to be talking about building more of a personal story and how to focus much more on a personal narrative rather than focusing your main narrative on something like the end of the world or something. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Slice of life is not swords and sorcery. Dungeons and Dragons is very much a game which is based around dungeons. As silly as it is to say. Dungeons are a huge component of what makes up the tabletop RPG experience. It is a combat-focused tabletop RPG. It is not necessarily built for roleplay, though some people definitely do use it for that. Instead of making our set piece a big dungeon that we are going to have to go through with lots of game mechanics and challenges that the players are going to have to conquer, instead our main challenges are going to be a little bit more personal and a little bit more less deadly, shall we say. Instead, what you're going to end up talking about is you're going to end up talking about a lot of trying to get prepared for the race. You're going to be talking about people's personal lives, people's personal relationships, and the drama that comes out from having a wide group of friendships and also rivals who are trying to compete in the same space. So yes, as I said, there are no dungeons and there are no combat. And this is the thing with tabletop RPGs, is there's a broad spectrum of games that you can end up playing. You don't have to play Dungeons and Dragons, because as much as we like Dungeons and Dragons, you know, there are a lot of different kind of settings that we can play in. I mean, there's so many different TV shows about so many different kinds of topics. It's not all about fantasy action. Instead, what we can talk about instead is people's personal relationships. Not everything has to have crazy stakes, but certainly losing a race for an athlete might be a really big deal for them. And they might have some sort of personal goal or personal ambition that they want to follow through with. In this kind of instance, we don't really have a big world-ending main plot. Instead, our sort of what we refer to as more secondary plots for our personal characters becomes that main initiative. This leaves us for room for, you know, mystery plot lines, social plot lines, but it does also allow us to explore some interesting themes and interesting topics. Umamusume focuses a lot on the lighter sides of sporting events, trying to get to some sort of goal and trying to inspire others to do amazing things. But you could also take things in a darker route and explore some of the more seedy and slightly more nefarious aspects of horse racing, or even some other sporting There's a lot of scope that you can do for more personal moral storytelling rather than the end of the world. So where do our big set pieces come from, really? Invariably, something like Dungeons and Dragons has a couple of big set pieces. The big bad evil guy at the end will be, one big set piece encounter. But also throughout the dungeon, you're probably going to have multiple big set piece encounters, which will probably form the backbone of the really cool things that your players are going to be doing. Instead, what we have is we should be developing scenes. Just like a TV show, we should be focusing very much on the conversations that the characters are having and the personal journey that they are going through. Instead of our big combat encounter, we can think of each of the individual scenes in a TV show that we're going to do as rooms in a dungeon. Not everything actually has to be continuous either. There's almost like a habit I find in a lot of people when they start playing Dungeons and Dragons, that they very much start to have everything act as one continuous scene. We don't just role play out the going to a shop and talking to the shopkeeper, and then we also role play out heading from that shop to the next shop, and etc. Not everything has to be continuous. Instead of role playing that whole encounter where we walk from one shop to another, we just cut that out and cut to the next, because we don't necessarily need to worry about moving between one shop to another. And this is kind of a habit which comes in when you start to play dungeon-specific encounters, because you're worried about every single aspect of what happens in a dungeon. Every room can have traps in it, as well as every corridor. So you're very much focused on what is happening all the time, constantly. But with a game like this, you don't really need to worry so much about that, and instead you can focus on where your action is. And that action is always going to be, what conversations are people having? So this is why I will say, cut the shoe leather. Have focused roleplay scenes. There's a wonderful little video by Professor DM where he talks about cutting the shoe leather specifically for Dungeons and Dragons. Wonderful little video. I don't necessarily agree with absolutely everything in that, but I will link it in the description because it's an amazing little video if you're interested in talking about cutting the shoe leather out of your campaign and making things a lot more streamlined. The other thing as well is, I will say, not everyone needs to be in a scene. There's very much a habit of D&D parties to stick together. And again, this comes from being in dungeons a lot of the time and being with combat encounters where you will need the entire party to focus on the combat encounter and focus on doing the dungeon. You need to stick together because splitting the party is generally a bad idea, right? But if you're not necessarily worried about, getting shot by skeletons, it's totally fine to have people wander off and do their own thing. If anything, it lets certain players have a bit of a break at the table, and also it allows other players to maybe a little bit more quieter to have their own specific scenes as they go off by themselves, and therefore can have the spotlight on them without the pressure of other players who are a bit more charismatic, shall we say, from taking over. So how do we structure a Umamusume Pretty Derby tabletop RPG? Well, I would probably structure it very similar to this nice simple graph. First off, you would have the big race at the very start, or probably at the very end. It's probably at the very end. I've probably gone and made this a little bit back to front, really. The first thing I'd probably focus on is the day-to-day school life of the Umamusume and what they're getting on with. At the end of the day, they have their own hopes and dreams, and they have their own relationships, and that should be the bulk of what you're doing. You're going to be talking to the people in the races, you're going to be worrying about what's going to happen next, and you're probably also going to be invested in whatever, high school drama is going on. That will then lead into the build-up to the race, because whatever is going on in day-to-day life should end up maybe affecting the preparations for the race, or maybe worried about what's going to happen in the big event. This all builds into the build-up to the actual event. Then we have the event itself, the big race, the big sports race, and you could definitely do this a couple of different ways. The big sporting event will probably end up being a series of skill checks or something like that, or it could be some kind of like doom clock or something like that we'll talk about in a later section. But yeah, we'll have the big sporting event be its own giant set piece, and then we have the fallout from whatever happens. Do we actually win the race and therefore get to do our own big concert? Or do we fail, and then we have to deal with the consequences that of what happens afterwards. And very neatly, that leads you back into your normal school life, and then, you know, heading back round to deal with the next particular race or whatever. So what are we actually going to be doing in this kind of tabletop RPG? Well, surprisingly, there's actually a lot that happens in the real world. There really, really is. There's a lot of things that people are always doing and always thinking about and always moving along with. No, nothing really stays still in the real world, right? And to be fair, there are also weeks, though, where generally nothing happens to it, and that's a bit of an oxymoron, right? So I wouldn't be too afraid to just let a week or two go by and just allow things to say, oh, you just kind of got on with things. I'm sure you've probably had a day or two or a couple of weeks where genuinely nothing has actually happened and you can't really remember what happened the last couple of weeks because not an awful lot was going on. Someone else was unfortunately taking up all of the valuable writer's time, probably. But hey, characters, though, should always be trying to do something. While your players should be the ones who are driving their own scenes and coming up with their own goals and moving the plot forward, there should always doing things, and this goes through a whole host of different tabletop RPGs. Your NPC characters should always be forming plans and acting on those plans, and also reacting to whatever the players do. If you really want a big bad evil guy in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, they should always be actively trying to do stuff. Always be trying to one-up the players and reacting to whatever the situation is. That's how you create a really dynamic, interesting game. So in this context, you should always have the NPC characters who are wanting to fulfill their own goals, and therefore they're going to start acting on them on their own initiative. And from that, you can build scenes where NPCs are doing new interesting tasks, and then the players can react to that and change up what your plan was going to be. And kind of like what I said before, this is kind of an opportunity to tell a light-hearted story, but you could also take a different approach as well. We tend to take Dungeons and Dragons quite seriously with fantasy epics and big stakes on the line. You can actually take this as an opportunity to just have a little bit of silly fun and more focus on just light-hearted storytelling and more slice of life sort of things. Focus on themes which are a little bit more personal, like growing up, relationships, or your place in the world, what it means to grow up and probably be an Umamuse, what your goals actually symbolize, and why you are attempting to fulfill this lofty goal or something like that. There's a lot of things that you could do with personal character-driven narrative. So let's talk about event clocks. There's two different event clocks that I'm going to be talking about. The first is the progression clock. A progression clock is where you have an event which is tied to the players completing some sort of prerequisite for it to fire, basically. So complete 4 ability checks over a certain threshold and win, and then you get some sort of event which is really good for you. Equally, you can have events which are also bad because a number of bad things happened in a succession, therefore a bad event fires, and then you have to go and deal with the consequences. This is different from a countdown clock, where you have a number of different things which slowly happen to count down to a particular event, like I said, usually over time. A progression clock is where the players try and drive that particular clock so that they actually invest in something happening. A countdown clock is just where something ends up happening through sort of no fault of their own. Usually countdown clocks are a little bit more obscured by the DM, and progression clocks are probably a bit more of a mechanic which your players may be a bit more aware of something like that. So let's talk about character-driven plot lines. Character-driven plot lines is very much going to be the bread and butter of this kind of tabletop RPG. Because we're talking about Umamuse and we're talking about sports, but realistically this kind of applies to a lot of different slice of life style tabletop RPG experiences that you might want to replicate. Really, this could also apply to your B plot of your Dungeons & Dragons campaign as well. It's not necessarily exclusive to, and we're not trying to explicitly exclude Dungeons & Dragons or anything like that. It's just I'm trying to sort of separate this from a very particular, a different kind of gameplay experience, basically. So let's have a little look about making a story about personal growth. Because at the end of the day, no character is set in stone. Every single character will have flaws, they will have wants and dreams and goals, and it is your job as a player and also as a dungeon master to set these goals for these characters. They're going to want to be actively trying to pursue and do something. But at the end of the day, it's not just about the goal at the end of it. It's about how they get to that and what they learn along the path to getting to their goal. They also end up building connections within a particular location, so make sure you are aware of, for example, for Umamusume, who's in one class with each other, who is in a friendship group with each other, who's on the student council, and who do they interact with. Who they are going to interact with is going to end up deciding what kind of personal connections they have, and who they are going to be talking to, who they are going to be having scenes with, and what they are going to be end up doing, basically. You can use those connections then to create emergent stories. So when you're going into this kind of scenario, you're probably thinking about what your NPCs are trying to do and what your NPCs are trying to solve, what their goal is, and they are going to have a plan. However, with characters interacting with each other over multiple different ways and adding players into the mix as well, it's very likely that those plans are going to change. And things might not necessarily go your way. And it's totally okay for things to not go your way, because that's how you get emergent storytelling, and you, instead of trying to fight up against that, because that wasn't how the plan was supposed to go, you have to roll with it. You have to roll with that story and keep pursuing it as it unfolds, basically. You'll end up creating new scenes that you didn't think of, because in the end of the day, somebody decided to go left when you were thinking they were probably going to go right, and now we have a new scene where maybe somebody ended up creating a new rival because you didn't expect people to get annoyed at somebody in particular, and therefore they've taken umbrage, and now there's a new rivalry on the field. Or you didn't actually expect somebody to talk to another person while they were doing something else and help out, and now you have a new friendship on the board that you weren't expecting. And those moments in tabletop RPGs are probably some of the most special. So like I kind of mentioned before, understand who knows who and who they are going to end up interacting with. Build a whole map of relationships so that you can understand where NPCs and where the players fit in this big world that you have. Likely this map is going to be dozens of characters big, but the more information that you have about who knows who and what they are going to be interacting with, the better you are going to be prepared for trying to manage this absolute web of connections and things going on. Characters should always be acting of their own initiative, and they're going to act on the people that they know in this web, so you can almost use that as a map to help you plan out what their moves are going to be. You can have pre-prescribed events locked in, either behind event clocks or pre-prescribed events that are going to happen no matter what. So, for example, the race that you're right at the end will probably be one big prescribed event, and that is going to bring everything that you have been talking about and all of the social interactions that you've had up to this point right to a head, and you can have a big climactic ending. And the other thing I want to talk about as well is that your players should be able to call their own scenes. We've talked about the scene technique already, about how the DM should be prescribing particular scenes with particular characters rather than telling a big long one singular sort of narrative, as it were. You should be focused on, okay, we're going to now set in this, we're going to call a classroom scene with these particular people, and this is the thing that has just happened. What do you do, sort of thing. Instead of the DM just doing that, the players should be allowed to talk to the DM and say, well, actually, I want a scene with these characters. And it doesn't necessarily matter what those characters are supposed to be doing at that given time, because there's probably going to be an opportunity where the player has that particular scene, or has that particular opportunity to make that scene happen. So just allow that to happen, even if they're not explicitly supposed to be in that particular location. If there is nothing stopping Lauren being in the classroom for this particular scene, why not, even if they're supposed to be at the gym at that particular time or something like that. It doesn't really matter all that much. Because at the end of the day, it's more important to focus on the players, allowing them to have scenes and allowing them to have growth, rather than it is to stick to one particular plan. Rather than having specific NPCs that you're going to flesh out, instead, prescribe a role and like almost like an NPC to fill that role. But if the players end up coming up with some kind of antagonist, for example, feel free to then, instead of having the rival that you planned for them, instead have that antagonist that the player has written become that rival, and then move that prescribed NPC that you have out of the game and save them for later. They were a template, they were a placeholder, but if the players actually have something that and they give it to you, use it. Because at the end of the day, they've just added something to your world, and they are going to be very, very invested in what they are going, in that particular plot line, because you're actively using the things that they are giving you. Because when your players go and write backstory for their characters, and they add NPCs, and they put in all this effort, they are actively telling you, as a DM, as a player, this is roleplay that I want out of this game. You should use that. You should take it into your game and make it a part of it. I see a lot of the time where players' backstory almost gets used for a specific episode. So it fills that entire episode, and it's almost like it's their episode. But if you go and make the player's lore a part of the game naturally, so that everything fits in and almost ties together into the main plot line, then all of a sudden you've given their character a big reason to be a part of the main plot line, to stay around and to be involved and care. Rather than having to worry about some other secondary issue which is also happening in the world. Have it tie in, and then you'll have an invested player who will remember that game very, very well. Roleplay is, after all, a cooperative activity. As a DM, you're not there to kill the players. Well, maybe if you're not playing a game where you're supposed to be trying to kill the players, of course. That is another way that you can treat Dungeons & Dragons, of course. But if you're not necessarily there to kill the players, I firmly believe that as a dungeon master, you are there to facilitate cooperative storytelling. You're not there to be an antagonist for the players' ideas. So there you go. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this little presentation, feel free to drop a subscribe. I'm going to be trying to do a couple more of these kinds of things. I also am going to be doing them live on Twitch. So if you want to catch them live when I do, feel free to hop over to my Twitch channel as well and hit a follow on there as well. Thank you very much for watching. Otherwise, cheerio.